Welcome back to Colossians, now in 3, where we'll do the first half of Colossians 3. You might want to put the video on pause and take a look at this cartoon by Johnny Hart. He is one of my favorite cartoonists, and always around Easter he has some Easter messages. It also applies, I think, a little to the lesson today. But before we get started, while you're turning to Colossians 3, there's news you might have missed, and this fascinates me. Perhaps you recall a year or so ago the bone box, which had the inscription, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, was brought even to the United States and showed to be an authentic bone box. And, well, there's also the Joash inscription, and it comes from the temple in Jerusalem, written by Joash, son of King Ahaziah of Judah. It corresponds to 2 Kings 12. Well, the Israeli Antiquities Authority felt that this was all a forgery. They've been bothered by the fact that they lack provenance. Provenance is when they know where it came from. It came from an archaeological dig. Well, these came from the antiquities market, owned by a private individual. And they got a committee of scientists together, they studied it and came up with a report saying it was a fake. But it was highly criticized because they did not report exactly how they did things, and they didn't report the data that they accumulated. That is a very unscientific method. And they still stuck with their guns and saying it was a forgery. In fact, they even took the owner to court. The trial took 7 years. It was tried under a single judge, and at the end, the owner was acquitted of being a forger, I should say. Well, recently, Herschel Shanks, the editor of Biblical Archaeology Review, got André Lemaire, who is a world-famous paleographer, studies ancient writings, and is at the Sorbonne, and he got Marilyn Lundberg from USC, who's a paleographer, and then Bruce Zuckerman and his group from California specialize in reflectance transformation imaging. And they studied this thing very carefully. The person here is Herschel Shanks, and they're looking at the pomegranate that I showed in the last picture. It's a rather small, it's not really ivory, it's probably from another animal, but it's a carving of a pomegranate. It was thought to be on a pole, a cane, and had etchings in it. And a key thing is to look where there's a crack, because it's very hard to make a forgery over a crack. And their conclusion was that it was not a fake. And it also implies very strongly that the other items, the bone box and the Joash inscription, are also not fakes. So unfortunately, it appears that the Israeli Antiquities Authority is being more political than they are scientific about this. Very unfortunate. Well, we're going to look at Colossians 3, 1-4, and start with that. And it says, if then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. The wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. Well, last week we talked about blood sacrifice, and particularly Jesus' blood sacrifice. It was kind of a bloody lesson. This week we're going to talk more about being raised with Christ, and it begins with baptism. And in that, a person dies and is risen to be a different person. In verse 1 it says, seek things that are above. The person's new focus is on the eternal, not on the physical. And this doesn't mean that the person is now so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good. Quite to the contrary. Paul will shortly give us ethical principles that a person should follow in the world to have an impact on the world. So the baptized person is to view his life as focused on God. He's no longer to live as if the world was all that mattered. His life then becomes an image of Jesus, which draws others to Christ. He continues to use things of this world, but he uses them in a different way. In verse 2, it says he sets his mind on things that are above. I like the way Barclay looks at this. He says, I lost my thought here, I'm sorry. Barclay says, in keeping with setting your minds on things above, giving is above getting, serving is above ruling, and forgiving is above avenging. Well, in verse 3, it says, your life is hidden with Christ in God. The Greek spoke of burial as being hidden in the earth. At baptism, we're buried and hidden with Christ in God. Barclay pointed out that the false teachers called their books wisdom or apocrypha, and the books were hidden from all except those who were initiated. Well, the word here for hidden has the same root. And the text implies that Paul is saying that pagans' wisdom is hidden in secret books, whereas a Christian's wisdom is hidden in Christ. But notice the wording of verse 3. It says, with Christ in God. Our wisdom is hidden with Christ in God. That is consistent with Jesus speaking in parables. In Matthew 13, it says, this is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. What is hidden is concealed, but it is discoverable. And for the most part, the world does not recognize Christ or the Christian. In 4, Paul talks about when Christ will appear, and then you will also appear with him in glory. Then the judgment of God will overturn the judgments of men. It will no longer be hidden. Then the verdicts of eternity will reverse the verdicts of time. Well, now look at 4 again. Notice a qualifier. In verse 4, Christ who is in your life. Now some might say, music is my life. I think I misread that, Christ who is your life. Some might say, music is my life, or baseball is my life. The person's highly devoted to that pursuit. They're knowledgeable, they're capable, they're talented. They spend a good portion of their time in that pursuit. Well, for the Christ follower, Christ is your life. At this point, I'd ask for comments, and actually we didn't get any this week, so I'll move on to verses 5 to 10. And it says, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. In these you too once walked, when you were living in them. But now you must put them away, anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices, and put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. Well, Paul began Colossians 3 with a little theology. He says, if then that you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Thomas Aquinas defined theology as taught by God, teaches God, and leads to God. So who is this God, and whose are we? Well, now Paul becomes practical and emphatic about what leads to God, so we can know whose we are. He focuses on self, our inner being. In verse 5, he says, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you. Now, in Romans, it says the same thing, but a little more gently. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if you live by the Spirit, you put to death the deeds of the body, and you will live. So the Roman speaks of death as the result of actions. If earthly, you die. Colossians speaks of death as an imperative. Kill the earthly and live. Say the same thing, but different ways. Well, what is the earthly? Well, self-centeredness, pride, anything that's a barrier between you and God. Well, last week we went into gory detail about the blood and the blood sacrifice, and this command is a demanding one of blood sacrifice, killing self, offering a blood sacrifice, that is myself, and that's just like Jesus. And why? Is to live. So how do we kill self? Well, Paul then enumerates some earthly habits that we must kill: sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. So let's look at these individually. Sexual immorality. Now, first of all, I'm a checklist kind of guy. I'm goal-oriented. I like lists, and I get a chemical kick, a little dopamine or something that occurs when I cross something off the list. And so I wish God had made a list of sexual sins, been more explicit, a detailed list with subparagraphs. It made life a little easier for me, at least as I investigate this. But, you know, the other thing about having a list is it's easier to point my finger. And as somebody pointed out, when you point your finger, you got one pointing right back at yourself. It's a natural tendency to measure other people against the list. Well, God made this list in Colossians to be private and personal. And by making it simple without exposition, we have to figure out what sexual immorality means. And perhaps in Paul's day it was more apparent, but that's a little hard to believe. When we put sexual immorality to death, we come closer to God. And isn't that what he wants us to do? Well, I still wish that we had a list, but let's look at the Bible for what makes sexual immorality. And of course, it's complicated by our being sexual beings, and men are supercharged sexual beings. Let's just pause for a minute and look at something else. A landmark year in our country is 1953, when Playboy magazine was published with Marilyn Monroe on the cover. And then we began to have more sexualized cars, which culminated in the 1957 Cadillac with breasts and nipples on the front. The 1958 Ford Edsel was a flop, and some have argued that the reason was because it had a vaginal grille, and that was just a little too much for the public. But did that stop us? Not on your life. In fact, today you're expected to score or collaborate or cohabitate, I should say, or abort mistakes. It's the new normal. So where do we draw the line? Well, that's where God lets us down a little bit. He didn't lay it out clearly. He left us to think, to study his word, to learn, to apply, and to obey. So to figure out what sexual immorality is, we first have to look at why did God make us? Well, I like this painting. It's interesting that it's painted by two famous artists. Bruegel did the landscaping, and Rubens did the people in this. And it's a Garden of Eden, of course. And why were people made? For relationship with God. That's our model. Relationship, though, is exclusive. It requires time, listening, understanding, and reproduction. We call this reproduction evangelism. But God made man in his own image, and he made woman to be an ezer or a helpmate. And he blessed that union. And he later condemned unions based on momentary pleasure. We call that prostitution or pornography. And he also condemned non-begetting unions. Notice that the text does not give license to judge others. The mandate is personal, that we must be exclusive. In the ancient world, sexual intercourse outside of marriage was common and accepted, kind of like today. The Christian ethic of chastity in the Roman world and today is remarkable and fragile. In verse 5, it talks about impurity, passion, and evil desire. And for the most part, these concepts are self-evident. Phillips translates these as dirty-mindedness, uncontrolled passion, and evil desire. You know, when I accepted Christ, I swore a lot. I was in the army, and it was not unusual. I used it with uncontrolled passion, and I used it as a punctuation mark. But when I became a Christ follower, it no longer seemed appropriate. Now, I still have that nature. Check me out in the garage sometime when I'm building something. I try to live differently, but regardless, it does slip out. So I struggle with what Jesus said in Matthew 5. He said, "You therefore must be perfect, as our Heavenly Father is perfect." The problem with looking microscopically at any of these ethics is that we can lose the big picture. And a Christian is not to be like Cinderella, who abandoned some filth to a princess for one night. It's a long-term commitment. And Paul is calling for a fundamental change, to be a new person. So don't be fooled. It's nothing like society's new person. In today's society, when someone is seriously ill and then recovers, we say he's a new person. Or when someone is depressed and unemployed and broke, and then they get a job and their financial situation turns around, and you say that made him a new man. That's not what he's talking about. This is a deeper level of change, a fundamental change. We're born again, we're new, we're different, we're totally changed. So in 5, it goes on to covetousness, which is idolatry. And I must admit that I never really thought of covetousness as idolatry. Usually it's defined, covetousness, as an inordinate desire for something, usually belonging to someone else. If it's not mine, therefore it belongs to somebody else, so self-evident. But that desire, might be an intangible, like a talent, like somebody who plays basketball so well they could be in the NBA, and I wish I had that talent. That's covetousness. The real question then is, what is inordinate desire? Well, when normal desire crosses over to become inordinate, that is the problem. And let's just reverse this argument and see if it holds. Idolatry is the desire to control. Control what is not mine to control. Idolatry is a desire to control. And so when I want chance or a spirit or a God to do something for me, to have control for me, that is idolatry. I'm giving it authority that it shouldn't have. Idolatry is also the desire to get God, the Almighty God, to do something for my purposes. That's trying to control God. And when I invest power in an object and direct that object to do my bidding, that is idolatry. And that's an inordinate desire. That's covetousness. Therefore, covetousness is indeed idolatry. Barclay points out a few nuances in covetousness. The Greek word means to have more. It's insatiate desire. And it's kind of like when you try to fill a bowl of water when the bowl has a hole in it. You can pour and pour and pour, but you can't fill it as the water runs out. That's insatiate. The desire includes money, which is theft, power, which is tyranny, position, hubris, and person, which is sexual sin. And very importantly, covetousness is the opposite of the desire to give. And remember, is it not more blessed to give than to receive? Well, all of these sins have been present since the beginning. In verse 6 it says, on account of these sins have been present since the beginning. I misread that. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. In other words, there's going to be a judgment day. Unless we know the truth, Paul reminds us in verse 7, in these you too once walked when you were living in them. Thus, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. In 8, it says, but now you must put them all away. And then it lists anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. Now, the Greek image, put them away, is like putting off your clothes. That's the image of that word. It ties in with baptism. Put off your clothes. Walk down to the water. Be immersed. Be new. And then redress. And when we redress, we put away anger, wrath, malice, and slander. Now, what is anger? Well, anger is orge. That's long-lasting anger. It percolates, it penetrates, it separates us from communion with God and others. And then it petrifies us. So it percolates, penetrates, and petrifies. Now, wrath is thumos, and it's a sudden burst of anger, wrath. My son Ben struggled with blazes of sudden anger when he was very young, and one day he couldn't find his mother, so he punched his fist through a glass window. Well, the subsequent stitches were a valuable lesson in self-control. One of the members pointed out at this point that Jesus demonstrated wrath, and I'll talk about that a little later. Malice. Barclay says it's a viciousness of mind which all individual vices spring, and Hitler comes to mind as a stark model of this all-pervading evil. But I prefer to remember a positive note in Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, in 1865, in his second inaugural address, when he said, with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. Well, slander is insulting speech, and when that's directed towards God, we call that blasphemy. The word used here in the Greek is blasphemia, very similar. And when it's directed to another person, it insults the sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross, dying for all sinners. It's an insult to Jesus. The victim of slander, in one instance, was approached by a penitent Christian who asked for forgiveness. And the victim said, yes, I will forgive you, but I want you to take your pillow and take a feather from the pillow and put one feather on the doorstep of each person in the village. And it was late in the afternoon, but enough light was there, and this person went out and placed multiple feathers all over town on the doorsteps. And then they went back and said, I've done this, and I again beg your forgiveness. And the slandered person, the victim, said, now go and remove all the feathers and put them back in the pillow. Well, the slanderer said, it's impossible. And the victim said, so it is for me to restore my reputation. Slander has consequences. Now, obscene talk is like throwing mud on someone or something. It dirties one's hands in the process. The last three things, malice, slander, and obscene talk, are about speech. Remember, the tongue is like a rudder on a ship in James. Malice, slander, and obscene talk, we can turn them into some positives. Speech must be kind. Speech must be considerate. Speech must be pure. And my parents would have added another command. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. Do not lie to one another in verse 9. And why is truth so important? Well, think about this. What about a young man who's embracing his girl, and he whispers in her ear, "I love you." Well, what's she to think? Thinking might be difficult at that moment when there's a surge of chemicals in her body. In modern jargon, they're at the next level. But then a little later, in this classroom, which is divided by a partition, she hears his voice on the other side. As she peeks around, she sees him embracing another girl and whispering in her ear, "I love you." What is she to think? We all say we value truth, but few people really seek it, and even fewer find it. Once upon a time, the man's word was his bond. It was his truth. Well, certainly the word of a follower of Christ should be his bond. We were made in the image of God, and God doesn't lie. Well, at this point, I would ask for comments, and I'm going to go on since you can't make any. So we're going to read verses 10 to 13. It says, "Here there is no Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all. Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so must you also forgive." Well, the summary of this is that Jesus made it a level playing field. No one has preference. We're all equal in the sight of God. But let's break it down a little bit, because there's some interesting things here. There are disparate categories of people. And the first is the Greeks. And the Greeks were the aristocrats of the ancient world. They were educated. They were cosmopolitan. They looked down on lesser cultures. Non-Greek speakers were considered to be barbarians. Now, the Jew was an aristocrat of the religious world. He was educated, chosen, and they looked down on every other nation. And all others were fit for the fires of hell. Now, of the barbarians, the Scythians were the lowest. They were the barbarians of the barbarians. They came out of Russia, and Josephus wrote that it says, "Now as to the Scythians, they take pleasure in killing men, and differ but little from brute beasts." A slave was human property. It really had no rights at all. It could be disposed of as the owner liked. So Paul is recognizing different categories, separate categories according to birth or race, creed, culture, and class, among other things. And Paul says we're all brothers. We're all sons of God. We're all the same. We're all on a level playing field, and there is no preference among us. All are equal in the sight of God. And moreover, we must look out for one another. And he says in the middle part, God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. These words belonged, with quotes, to the Jews, the chosen people. They were holy, separate, dedicated nation, and they were beloved. They were the most favored nation. Each quality is also interpersonal. Notice that Paul doesn't mention personal qualities such like efficient, diligent, or industrious. The basic biblical qualities are virtues that govern relationships. They're interpersonal. And then he says, put on compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, weakness, and patience, bearing with one another, forgiving. Well, compassionate hearts, it also can be translated as hearts of pity. It was a pitiless time in Rome. The aged, the weak, the infirm, the mentally challenged, they were cast out. And under the inspiration of Christianity, over time, this tradition, if you will, was reversed. And he talks about kindness. Well, the Greek word here, according to Barclay, meant the virtue of a man whose neighbor's good was as dear to him as his own. Josephus used the word to describe Isaac. And remember, Isaac dug wells and gave them to others because he wouldn't fight them. It's also the same word that Jesus used when he said, "My yoke is easy." It is goodness which is kind. And that's like the way Jesus treated the profligate woman who anointed his feet. The next word is humility, and it's a virtue that was, in a sense, created by Christianity. There's no other word in the Greek language, classic Greek, for humility. Today, it implies servility, but that's not really appropriate. It's an awareness that we're all God's creatures, all God's creations, from birth to present. And as such, we have no claim outside of the grace of God. We're all sons of God's on a level playing field. And then meekness, that has a bad connotation as well. Gentleness is meekness, but there's more. I was told this comparison years ago. His name slipped me, but a pastor in Colorado Springs. And he pointed out that the aspect of this word is like a horse. A horse is a dangerous animal, and that the horse can step on you, stomp on you, and kill you if he kicks you. But you put a bit in the horse's mouth, and you can take that horse anywhere. That's power under control. And when we have power under control, that's meekness. A meek person is angry at the right time, like Jesus in the temple, and never angry at the wrong time. In meekness, there's self-control because it's God-controlled. And then there's patience. And patience is a person who's not driven to despair or cynicism by foolishness or people who are unteachable. Not embittered or angered by the ill treatment of people or by insult. Instead, it reflects a divine patience which bears our own sins and others. And all this is closely related to bearing with one another, forgiving each other. And then remember in particular, in the last verse it says, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive. And we end with comments, and I don't have anything to draw out particularly on that, so I'm going to rush on to the final thing about Mickey Rooney. I just found this to be interesting. He died at age 93. He was a son of vaudevillians, and when he was 5 years old, he was on the Warner Brothers studios. He was there for a film, and he went into another room where there was a cartoonist named Walt Disney. And Walt said, come over here and sit in my lap. And he sat in his lap, and Walt showed him a mouse that he had drawn. And Rooney said, well, that's a good-looking mouse, Mr. Disney. And Walt replied, it sure is, Mickey. And then he paused for a moment and said, Mickey, tell me something. How would you like me to name this mouse after you? I sure would like that, but right now I got to go and get a tuna sandwich. And he jumped off Disney's lap. Well, 8 marriages became fodder for late-night comedians. And after the death of his mother and 5th wife in 1966, he battled substance abuse and financial problems. Over breakfast at Lake Tahoe in a casino coffee shop, he was greeted by a busboy with blonde curls, white rose complexion, and shining teeth. That's in quotes. And the man had called his name, and Rudy stood up thinking that he had a telephone call. But the busboy leaned towards him and whispered in his ear, Mr. Rooney, Jesus Christ loves you very much. And then the mysterious busboy vanished. When Rooney looked for the young man and gave a description to the manager, he was told there was no such person working there. Rooney believed that he'd been visited by an angel. He gave his life to Christ, and in 1990s he boldly proclaimed a very orthodox faith centered on Jesus Christ as his Savior. And in 1995, in an interview, he described himself as an unabashed Christian. Quote, I've given my life to God. I try and do the right thing, but inevitably and unfortunately I do the wrong thing. I suffer from being human." End quote. Well, his oldest son became a born-again Christian and is involved in evangelical ministry. And one final quote from Mickey says, "You should take your children to the church and teach them about Jesus Christ and about God, who makes the sun shine and the moon glow and gives us so many blessings." Well, God bless you, Mickey Rooney, and God bless you. Thanks for watching.